to the Tough Fish Show. I am so excited to bring to you Deborah Shepherd. Deb, thank you so much for being on the show.
Oh, thank you for inviting me, Jen. It's so nice to be here.
Absolutely. I'm so excited that you're here. And I would love for you to start out with, how did you get into writing?
Oh, well, let me tell you how I got into writing this book. I always wrote when I was a little girl and in school and things like that. And 30 some odd years ago, I was raising my kids with my husband. My marriage was falling apart. And I started to have these fantasies about how would my life be different with somebody else. And I started writing about that. And so in my book, my character leaves her children at summer camp and runs off and takes off looking for a previous love. I didn't do that. I wrote about it. So it was a long time ago. It was, as I said, over 30 years ago. I wrote it on a word processor, which for those of your audience who are really young, it came way before computers, and wrote it at night on my kitchen table. And I was very naive in those days. I thought you just write a book, you write it once, you send it out. So I sent it out to a publisher whose name I found in a book, came back in the same box that I'd sent it out. I don't think they have even read it. I decided it wasn't worth reading. So I put it in a cardboard carton and I put it in the back of my closet. And it followed me from place to place as I moved from upstate New York to New Jersey, now to Maine. And when I retired, I'm a social worker and I was directing a nonprofit. When I retired, I started taking a class in writing, and I came home and I said, I think I'm going to write a novel. And my husband said, do you remember that piece of juvenilia you put in the closet years ago? He said, why don't you pull it out? Because maybe there's some stuff in there that you can use for this new novel and you won't have to work so hard. Ha. So I pulled it out. I literally had not looked at it in over 30 years. And I read it and I thought, this is not so bad after all. So two or 3 years work after that, this is my book. So
happy together. Love it.
Thank you. So happy together. And I guess the moral of the story is it's never too late, right?
It is. You're right, though. But what I also heard was that there was a passion that started a lot longer. Like it was something that it was always there. It was always kind of like a little niggle, and it kind of kept showing up in different spots. Even if you had a career in social work, as you said, but you had life going on around you, and still this little niggle kept kind of showing up and saying, hey.
Right. Well, it was more than a little niggle, because in my social work career, I was a director of an agency, 2 agencies actually. And I had to write grants, I had to write reports, I had to write op-ed pieces. So I was consistently writing, but I wasn't doing this kind of writing. And I did so much writing that when I retired, I said, I'm never writing anything longer than a grocery list. That's it. Until this started, I started to obviously there was something niggling because I took a class, right?
Well, but you
Yeah.
said something interesting too, because you're right. Grant writing, or writing in the corporate world, so to speak, in a business setting, that's a different type of writing. It could be persuasive, it's technical in some ways, but it's not creative writing. So what was that transition like to go from a technical or a business style writing, or even a marketing style writing, to more creative writing?
Well, it's interesting because even though I was writing grants and reports, in order to get thousands and thousands of dollars from a government or from a foundation, you have to tell stories. You have to touch people's hearts, right? If you are I was working with survivors of domestic violence, and we needed money to run our shelter. So we had to tell stories about how our organization changed these people's lives. So I was writing stories, short little pieces. So they all collected in my brain, I think, is what happened. And when I retired, there was no place for them to go except on paper.
So how did the creative writing class help you?
Well, I was with it was actually run through senior college here. So I was actually with other people my age who were starting to write books or starting to write essays. So I felt in good company, and I felt relaxed enough to be able to share with that group. and not feel like some kind of anomaly, right? So that helped a great deal.
Oh, but I love that. So what you've touched on here though is a form of community, whether it's a critique group or whether it's, a sounding board or having the right type of editor in your background, to work with, or the right illustrator or graphic designer for your book, to have people that you really feel have your back, who are willing to encourage but guide, and now all of that is so helpful, not just in the craft of writing, but in the courage to share this manuscript that can go from just something you wrote for yourself to something you share in a book form with others.
Right, right. And the feeling was, well, if they're willing to share that, I'm going to go out on a limb and sort of share this, because the feedback for them was pretty positive. It was there were critiques, but it was all encouraging. And I thought, well, okay, I feel safe now, and I can share mine too.
I love that so much. So with this story that took a while to actually show itself in its current form of a book,
Right.
and it had its lull period between you initially writing it and then picking it back up again. What was it like to pick up the book, pick up the manuscript, and say, with fresh eyes, to look at it and say, what can I do with this? Do I really have something, or what do I need to do? How did you come through those decisions to decide, to know where the next step was for yourself?
Right. Well, I think I knew, I read it, realized it wasn't as bad as I thought 30 years before, but also realized there needed to be some changes. And I wasn't sure I was equipped to act on on what I thought it needed. So I took another class. We have a wonderful organization called Maine Writers and Publishers Alliance, and I took a class with a developmental editor, and we had to send in a snippet of stuff beforehand, and she had written a critique. And during the class was on point of view, I remember. During the class, I looked at what she had critiqued and I rewrote the scene during the class. So I'm still not sure about point of view because I wasn't paying attention. I was writing. And afterwards, I showed it to her and she said, "Yeah, that's it." And I thought, okay, she gets it. And she gave me some really pointed critique earlier. So I asked her if she would be my developmental editor. And we developed a relationship, and we worked for about 18 months on this book. And then I got it published, not before I'd shopped it around and got rejected, but I knew there was a home for it somewhere.
Okay, so all right, you've shared a few more pieces I can't wait to dig into. But so, for instance, when one of the things you mentioned here was essentially you did a form of a sample. So as a developmental editor, I talk with people, but I also look at a sample, because it's just as important for me to be able to assess, hey, am I the right person for it? Am I off, I'm going to offer feedback, but it's the other piece about that is sometimes it doesn't matter what the feedback is as much as it matters how it was delivered and from whom. So if you got feedback from the right person, you can take it a bit and do something with it. Then you might have gotten that same piece of feedback from someone else and you go, I can't do something. So how
Right.
did you know that this person that you chose to work with, how did you feel when you knew that she was it? How did that feel for you to
I
encourage
think,
someone else?
all right, I felt like she got me,
Yeah.
and that we shared kind of a sense of humor about things. In fact, I asked her to do my book launch with me from a local bookstore. I mean, it was COVID, so it was, Zoom. But when we sort of had a run through, she appeared with a funny wig, just to relax me. And so, we were on the same wavelength, I think. I felt it. And in fact, I'm writing a memoir now, and I'm working with her on that too.
Oh,
And
that's
it's not,
beautiful.
yeah, it's not like, I got back her critique, and I was able to say, oh yeah, this is right. I got back her first critique, and I was gobsmacked. I didn't know, it's like, what are beats? What is sequence? What is, there was all this kind of sort of organized stuff. And I just, when I write, I just write. But I sat with it for a little while, and she was absolutely right. And when I took her advice and sort of was able to sit with it a little while, I knew she was exactly right. I went through several versions, and I was pretty convinced I had my novel, right? And I presented the manuscript to her, and she reads it. She goes, "Nope, not a novel yet." I went, "What?" She says, "Where's your inciting incident?" I said, "What's an inciting incident?" She explained to me what an inciting incident was. And I said, "Well, I just read this book, and there was no inciting incident. There was just this woman who was going through menopause, and she went on a road trip." And she says to me, my editor says to me, "What? And you don't think menopause is an inciting incident?" So I thought, okay. So I went home, I wrote an inciting incident. She said, "You got it." It was just, but so she was able to deliver things I needed to hear, but in a way I could hear them.
Absolutely. And yeah, and that's so important. So you get this manuscript to a point now that you feel like, okay, now I've got it. Now I feel like I can go through the submission process again, because you tried before. So now we're doing it
Once I
again.
tried with one person, right?
Well, but you still
Yeah.
tried. And so now we're looking at it like, okay, essentially you have a new book. You have a new book you're ready to start. Do you want it to just to pitch to get out into the world? How did you go about that process?
Well, I found I went online, and I Googled agents, and I sent my what is it? I can't remember, Poets and Writers, or one of the major publications that lists all the agents. And I sent query letters out, and I sent samples out, and sometimes they didn't even bother to reply. Often they didn't bother to reply.
Right.
Some of them I got back, "Thank you for sharing, not right for us." Da, 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 da. So then I did an in-person pitch in Portland, also through the Maine Writers. As you can tell, I live in Maine. Maine Writers and Publishers Association Alliance, I mean. And I made an appointment to pitch to 2 or 3 agents. They were having like 5 minutes. So a couple of them said, "Sorry, not right for us." I had already sent them the stuff. This one agent said to me, "I really like this, but I'm sorry, I don't handle writers of historical fiction. I don't represent them." And I went, "Historical fiction? This isn't historical fiction. This is like the 60s and the 80s. This is my life, right? This is the period of time when I came of age, not history." She goes, "And publishing is history." So so then I realized I had written a piece of historical fiction. And it's interesting, as I'm getting reviews back, I can tell how young the reviewers are, because they'll say, "It's so nice to look back to that time," or it's, when things were so whatever, and how our society has changed in all those years. So I'm a little more comfortable now with historical fiction. So anyway, she rejected it. Then I keep another panel. I went to a panel about publishing, and it was also run by Maine Writers and Publishers Alliance, which, by the way, anybody can join. They don't have to be in Maine, because a lot of the stuff now is on Zoom. So it was a panel about publishing, and there was somebody who'd been traditionally published, somebody who self-published, and then hybrid publishing. There was somebody who'd been published by a hybrid publisher. And I realized that I probably was not going to get published by the big 5. I'm so technologically inept that I didn't think I could do the self-publishing. It would send me off the deep end, I knew. And then this idea of hybrid publishing sounded really interesting. And the person who was on the panel, she lives in my town, actually, and we had lunch. And she gave me the ups and the downs of it, and and the pros and the cons. And I decided I would submit my book there. And before that, though, as I said, I had a developmental edit, and then I had a whole copy edit. So it was pretty ready to go. and they accepted it as is, which was great. So,
You put a lot
so
of
it was
effort into it.
a lot, more than I thought from the beginning. But I think that's true of anything, right? I think if you know at the beginning what it's going to entail, you might not. It's like childbirth, right? You might not do it. But anyway, it's been a great experience for me.
So when you were in the process of submitting, so you've submitted this book, you're working with this publisher now. What happened next? Like, what was it like seeing it come to fruition so that you actually had this book in hand? Like, because what I'm hearing as underpinnings for a lot of this was recognizing so many unknowns, going with the flow, but but staying open to when to do different things. But I also hear a really big theme about network, about community involved. So I'm curious. So now that this publisher is involved, we're building another form of community because you've had community helping with the critiquing. You started to build your village between your editor, your publisher. So can we talk a little, continuing this path of this village that you're building, this network that you're building to get this book into hands? Would you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, I feel really lucky that I found She Writes Press, because not only did they give me what I think is a beautiful book with a great cover, and traditional distribution through Ingram Publishing Services, they gave me a writing community, because we have a website, not a website, I'm sorry, there is a website, but a Facebook page. And if somebody has a question like, hey, I'm thinking about going with this podcast, has anybody had any experience? Or I'm thinking about, do I pay for a Kirkus review? Any questions you had, you could just post, and immediately you'd have like 20 people responding. And it felt so great. I have friends in my community who are my friends, but they don't get it about the writing and the publishing. And all of these people, most of whom I've never met, get it, because they're going through the same thing. So I feel really lucky. And I found a lot of my publicity and marketing outlets through that group.
Nice. Very, very cool. So you're leveraging a network between the publisher, what the publisher brings, because the publisher is helping with the book layout, the graphic design, the cover design, that type of piece, as well as if they were providing an editor or editing services as well, which most publishers are going to do that.
They do, but mine, because I'd had a developmental edit and a copy edit, they read it and they said this is fine.
Exactly. But now they're also involved helping you to get it into the market, to not just the community of hey, what Facebook group or what podcast should you pitch, but you also had to do a lot of that for yourself. What was that like?
Well, I hired a publicist. They recommended different publicists, because I knew I didn't have the connection. I mean, I had some of them through the group, but I needed a publicist, and I did hire a publicist, and we had a contract for 6 months, which was a little pre publication, and then let's say 4 months after that. And she got me sort of out there in venues where I never would have found, and even my group wouldn't have probably found. So that was lovely. And along with that came a social media consultant, which I really needed, because I needed my grandson to set up my author Facebook page. So it was, that was another great perk.
But I like that though, because I mean, you're demonstrating that it doesn't matter when you start this process. It matters that you're always learning. And even if this was even if this is the 15th book, you're still learning different parts. You're still navigating different things, because the industry can change with what they're looking for, or a new platform comes out, or a different way to do something, or if you learned a different skill set, or you gained more experience, and that experience comes through in what you're able to do. So I love that you are showing how just the evolution of that process. And it doesn't matter if the book, I say that it doesn't matter that the book sat for a little bit, because maybe the book needed to sit for a little bit in order to get
It,
it to where it's supposed to be. And it's okay that it did, even though in the moment it feels like, did I just waste time? And you haven't.
right. It did. No, it definitely needed to sit. It's a much fuller book than it would have been, you know, 30, now it's 34, 35 years ago. So yeah.
And I think that this sounds really, really cool. So when you were in the writing process, whether it was getting the initial manuscript together or in the rewrites and the subsequent work you've done, did you ever have that inner voice sit there and tell you, what are you doing? Are you kidding? Or do you really want to write that? Are you thinking that's a good thing to be writing? Who's going to read this? Did you ever deal with that?
No and yes. So the no is I had a lot of confidence in the story. I knew it was a good story. There was one scene that I wrote, and I was, it sort of wrote itself, right? And I just wrote it, and then I had second thoughts because it was a controversial topic. It was only 3 pages out of the 300 and something book, page book. So I took it out. I wrote it from the point of view of a character who had been sexually abused as a child, and he was revealing to my main character. And then, I had second thoughts and third thoughts and fourth thoughts, and then I rewrote it from the point of view of the main character and what it was like to hear him reveal this. And it just didn't sit. It wasn't right. It didn't. And then I had we were talking earlier before this about an author and characters talking to the author, and I had this character talk to me and say, you know what, I need to be heard. I need to be heard. I need to be believed. And coincidentally, I was a director of a program for survivors of domestic violence, and the most important thing for survivors is to be heard and to be believed. So this character needed to be heard. So he needed to tell his story. So that's where I had a little bit of, but ultimately I'm glad I went with it that way.
Very cool. Very, very cool. Now, has that inner voice ever crept in now that it's published? Like, are you, to be confident enough to put yourself out there? Because sometimes it's a matter of saying, I love this book, but then I always encourage people like, yeah, I realize that, but you got to talk about it. You got to keep putting yourself out there, because that's how people will find it, is because you're talking about it. So have you ever felt a little bit like, oh my gosh, I've got to put myself out there again type of thing? And if
Right.
so, how'd you
Right.
overcome it?
Well, it's funny. The little piece I wrote on the back for the description starts out set in the sex, drugs, and rock and roll 60s. And Amazon took those words and with their whatever algorithm I can't figure out, put my book in the genre of historical erotica. Right.
No.
So,
Nope.
so I had a big, back and forth with Amazon. I mean, it's that behemoth out there, right? You don't know what. And finally, I got it changed, but it was, I think they changed it to 20th century historical romance or something. But so that gave me pause, and I'm going, oh no, I don't know what I'm going to do here. So there was that kind of thing, and I know that there are people who are going to find parts of my book not to their liking, but I've gotten so much positive feedback that that's enough to sort of bolster me, right?
Yeah.
For all this other stuff. I mean, not everybody likes everything, right?
Right. And that's actually, that's okay, because from another standpoint is that if the book is not attracting a certain reader or what have you, then it's also done its job, because it means that it's going to also be attracting the right readers, because
Right.
it should be pushing away readers who it's not really for. So
Right.
it's one of those things where you can look at that criticism or look at that feedback as, oh wow, the disappointing that didn't sit well, or you can look at it like, okay, thank you, this is good feedback and it's doing its job and
Right.
it's going to find the place it's supposed to. I like how you looked at that. That's really cool. When you were coming through the story, and I realize it's your life, I realize you lived through it, but did you need to do any kind of research to help to create the world or to construct a certain scene a certain way? I realize you're leveraging your background and expertise in some areas, but were you having to research in other areas?
Well, I am leveraging my background and expertise, as you say. It's a novel. It's not my life.
Right.
They're right.
Right.
There's a
Right.
whole story in there that is not. So I had to, because I lived through the 60s and I wrote the book 30 years ago, it was pretty accurate about, time and place and what happened. But memory plays tricks on you. And so for some of the scenery or the place, I needed to think, oh, was that happening that time, or is this, so there were specific little, would that model car have that at that time, but
Yeah.
other than that, so I did some research. I think obviously if I'd been writing a historical novel that came before my time, I would have to do a lot more research. And it's interesting because this is now labeled a historical novel. I have an idea for a real historical novel with intent that happens in the 1800s in Paris. So after I finish my memoir, that might be my next book.
Oh, how
But
exciting. Everybody
mhm.
heard it here first. So,
Yeah, but don't hold me to it because I have years to do. It's funny because you write a book and you send it in and you think, okay, so once my publisher accepted it, it was 18 months until it was
yeah.
published. So
Yeah.
you have to think about time that way.
Absolutely. This has been such a cool way to spend time too, speaking of that. And thank you so much. How can people connect with you, Deb? How can they connect with you and how can they find your book?
Okay, so the way they can connect with me is through my website, which is deborahshepherdwrites.com. So it's DeborahShepherd, writes, WRITES.com. That's my website. And I have a Facebook page, Deborah K. Shepherd, author. And where they can find my books. They can find my books wherever they buy books. And I really encourage people to go to their local indie bookstore because they need us. They've been there for us through the pandemic, and we need to keep them open. But if you buy books somewhere else, including online, you can go, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, bookshop.org, any of those places, or again, your local bookstore.
Very cool. Thank you so much for being on the show, Deb.
Thank you, Jen. It was great. It was a lot of fun.